This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Drone strike in Ethiopia's Tigray region kills more than 15 civilians. Military authorities in Mali still open to dialogue but plan solidarity protests against ECOWAS sanctions. And Southern African Development Community meets in Malawi to review progress of Mozambique mission. Hello and welcome to Africa Live, only on CGTN, wherever you're tuning in. I'm Mahia Mutua in Nairobi. Ramanyang joins me now with your business headlines.
That's right, Mahia. Here's what's coming up in the next half hour. Libya's government has ordered the immediate reopening of major oil fields in the country. And the European Union has lifted the suspension of flights to and from Southern Africa after Omicron variant concerns. We'll have the details on those stories and lots more coming your way in the course of the hour. For now, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Mahia.
Rama, thank you. We begin in Ethiopia, where local authorities say a drone strike has killed 17 civilians in the northern Tigray region. The civilians were reportedly killed in the town of Maitsebri. The allegation was made in a report by the zonal administration. Aid workers have also been cited by AFP news agency, basing their report on witness accounts. The strike allegedly happened on Monday, the same day when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was on a phone call with U.S. President Joe Biden. The federal government has yet to respond to these claims. Well, for more on this, we're now joined live by Girum Chala, who joins us from the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Girum, as we're hearing, reports have been filtering through about yet another deadly drone strike in the Tigray region. What more can you tell us about this?
Mahia, the 17 civilians reportedly killed by the drone attacks by Ethiopian military were reported earlier today by not only aid workers but also the Tigray Regional State people, spokespersons and the others. And this has been a repetitive report this week, perhaps the second time of this kind of reports that came out from that regional state of similar attacks claiming that they have been targeting civilians. Now, as you've said, the Ethiopian authorities so far have said nothing officially, but we try to speak to Ethiopian military officials and they're saying that the claim by TPLF and others is not really true. What we are doing is trying to keep the TPLF establishments which are posing threat to the country at bay, and whatever attacks, whether drone or airstrikes, are intended to demolish perhaps the military establishments in that region and state, not necessarily civilians. And this is against the policy of the government. It's inhuman, and it's just that it is a media propaganda that TPLF and others are trying to disseminate across the world. So far, anonymous Ethiopian officials from the military side have said this, but we have to wait and hear from the military, from Ethiopian officials, to say something in a statement or otherwise, Maya.
And Girum, are the drone attacks then part of a sustained campaign by the Ethiopian military to rout out Tigray rebels?
So if you remember a month or so back when the war in general terms ended, after Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed went to the war front for 3+ weeks and pushed the TPLF force back into their regional state after freeing several cities. Remember, they were so close to Addis Ababa, now they are back in the Tigray regional state. The military said that it will stick around in the borders of the Afar and Amhara regional state, between Tigray, that is, and Afar, and also the Amhara regional state, in order to maintain peace, first of all, and give way for peaceful dialogue which can resolve this conflict this time around. But the Ethiopian military promised that in the meantime it will keep on attacking several locations, military locations, training camps, ammunition warehouses and others, so that it can sustain the peaceful situation in those parts of the country, and also to maintain the constitutional order of the country. And part of that job is to stage drone attacks and airstrikes. So So yes, to answer your question straight up, Ethiopia wants to keep those perhaps quote-unquote enemies at bay and through the airstrikes and drone strikes, as it has the air capabilities and also strengths at this moment in time. So they will continue doing so, but they are promising that these airstrikes and drone strikes are not intended to be held against civilian establishments, camps and otherwise, but they are against TPLF force establishments which are terrorizing the central part of the country and also border towns, Mahia.
And finally, Girum, what is being done to minimize civilian casualties there, which is understandably raising international concern?
Well, this is a very tricky question. The Ethiopian military is promising that these are military precision kind of attacks that are being held. As you know, drones generally, for a general knowledge, operate in terms of calculations. And the Ethiopian military is saying that whatever attacks are being held, we are trying to avoid military civilian establishments, villages, or buildings which are used for public purposes, and also makeshift camps for that matter, so that we can attack what are potentially places where dangerous activities, conspiracies are being held, such as training camps and ammunition warehouses, as I was saying earlier. So they are saying that they have done everything and all the things that are possible in their capacities to avoid civilian casualties, and they're saying that so far the job has been done perfectly well. That's why the Ethiopian military has regained control of most of the areas by fighting only the enemy, not the people. Remember, this has been a civil war, and if it continues, it's going to continue as a civil war. So Ethiopia must take precautionary activities. This is, again, from the international community, not to affect its people, whether they are living in Amhara, Afar, or in the Tigray regional state, as they belong to the same country.
All right, Girum, thank you for bringing us the latest there. CGTN's Girum Chala joining us from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Moving on, the UN envoy to Mali is due to present a report to the UN Security Council on the situation in the country. Leaders from ECOWAS agreed to sanction Mali on Sunday over delayed elections. The decision was later backed by former colonial power France at the UN Security Council. Mali's interim government has condemned the tough measures. They include border closures, a trade embargo, and the cutting off of financial aid to Mali. The authorities have called for nationwide demonstrations on Friday against stringent sanctions.
It is regrettable that the efforts of the transitional government were ignored. Fellow countrymen, it's time for all Malians to unite to express and affirm our principles and defend our nation. Every Malian, wherever he or she is, has to act as a defender of the superior interest of Mali. Given the severity of the situation, it's everyone's responsibility to shut all divisions, to assemble around what's more important, which is Mali, our nation. I call for constant mobilization and resilience in the face of the situation. I have to say that even if we regret the illegal and inhuman nature of some decisions, Mali remains open to dialogue with ECOWAS in order to find a consensus between the interest of the Malian people and the respect of the organization's fundamental principles. Our commitment to a return to a normal, secure and peaceful constitutional order has never failed. We once more call on ECOWAS to thoroughly analyze our country's situation while putting the interest of the Malian people above all considerations.
Well, airlines from neighboring West African countries and former colonial ruler France cancelled flights to Mali on Monday. The continuing sanctions are isolating military authorities. For more on this, here is our guest reporter Mamadou Tapili in Bamako.
Since Malians have heard about these different sanctions coming through ECOWAS on Mali because of the military still on the power being incapable to give a clear chronogram concerning the organizations of the elections. I think the population's more focusing on the security situation. And for them, without the security situation being solved, it won't be possible to get really a proper and clear elections as how ECOWAS is expecting. So in these situations, it's becoming a bit unfair for the populations that the ECOWAS is imposing the vision to Mali to organize this election because they think it's unfair. It doesn't match with the security situation. So in this case, is the military who's getting some increasing more unpopularity of sustainable for people of the population who's trying to bring the sustain to them to resist and find out the solutions to how to re-secure the places, good negotiations before they get to the election, before they can give a chronogram, a clear chronogram for the election. Of course, after this condemnations of the ECOWAS upon Mali, automatically Malian also governments have through his territorial administration minister, which is Mr. Abdoulaye Maiga, has declared that Mali also will react to it, which are more about the same action as ECOWAS have been taken for Mali also to close his border to the different ECOWAS members countries. Of course, this is the same reaction, and to reassure also the population to know that it's only the ECOWAS members borders which are closed. I mean, on air and also on terrorist, which are closed. But that it means it's still that there are different countries which are not ECOWAS members are still open. So the airplanes will continue to be rotating, and that situation, the other action they've been taking is concerning to recall the reminding of the different ambassadors of ECOWAS members in the country. So that's the expectations. It's been the declarations. So we're expecting that's how it's going to happen if they're going to be convoyed the next couple of days coming. The conditions will be complicated because for the moment they have opened like the proposals of the Malian government through its president Assimi Goïta was to give the result, the conclusions of the national meeting, which happens just last month ago, from the 27th to the 30th. So in this gathering, their conclusion was to give a chronogram concerning the elections about from 6 months to 5 years, and finally they have handed over to ECOWAS for 4 years, which throughout of this these sanctions has been came to Mali. But in these situations, Assimi says it seems to be illegitimate and unhuman to condemn Mali and to put these sanctions on top of Mali, but still he's open to dialogue with ECOWAS in order for ECOWAS to find really a better situations, to learn more about the Malian situations in order to give a chance to these transitions, not to condemn, I mean, not to blame the populations, but in a way how they can review, I mean, the time of the real chronogram, because for ECOWAS 4 years is much, and they're expecting the governments of Mali to give probably a reasonable dates for the implementations of the elections. But for the moment, we think that Assimi says in his declarations that he has taken all the precautions to react face to ECOWAS sanctions and all these things. But I think this is all much more in a diplomatic situations. It will be in a way probably in those couple of days to bring situations in, or probably another solution to a proposal to the ECOWAS members and see how they can fit up instead of isolating Mali in these situations.
Moving away from West Africa now, Somali President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed addressed the nation a day after several key leaders, including the Prime Minister, reached an agreement to conclude the delayed parliamentary elections. The head of state welcomed the new agreement and urged leaders to realize and implement the new timeline.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this opportunity to commend the positive outcome of meeting on the parliamentary election by the National Consultative Council. The communique of the meeting has produced answers to the grievances and challenges facing the process and strengthened the election agreements of 17th September 2020 approved by the Parliament.
The Somali president also touched on the need to rebuild the security agencies to ensure a smooth transfer from the African Union peacekeeping mission stationed in the country.
Our efforts and successful plans to rebuild the armed forces have led to our heroic forces being able to take over the security of the country today. And we are finalizing the transitional plans to take over the security of the country from the African Union peacekeeping force AMISOM, whose forces have sacrificed their life.
Now, tension between protesters and military leaders continues in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, following the recent resignation of Abdallah Hamdok from the post of Prime Minister. The United Nations political mission in the country has urged opposition groups to reach a settlement and end the unrest. But protest blocs have rejected the initiative and are instead calling for an escalation of demonstrations against the military authorities. Naba Mohideen reports from Khartoum.
After weeks of unrest, the streets of Sudan are still filled with protesters campaigning against the military's takeover of power, with the number of those killed in clashes continuing to rise. The United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, has stepped in by offering to mediate between political powers and the military. But while the Sovereign Council that was formed after October's coup welcomed the UNITAMS initiative, the opposition group Freedom and Change Forces rejected it. It has asked UNITAMS to stop interfering in the political issue. Tens of people have been killed in demonstrations since the takeover on October 25th. Even a deal to stop the bloodshed with the former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok could not calm the streets. The Sudanese people are still divided.
Protests will continue until we achieve our demands, but political actors should prioritise the public interest and get rid of personal gains. Transparency is the solution for this crisis.
The ongoing escalation is not leading to anything. In my opinion, the solution is whether to hold fair elections or the Sovereign Council that was formed by the military should step down and accept handing over the power to the civilians.
The new Sovereign Council has announced it's preparing for elections in 2023, but analysts like Rashid Mohammed think a comprehensive dialogue needs to precede the polls.
All of the actors are agreeing on the importance of the dialogue, the presidency of the Ministers' Council by a civilian leader, and the importance of the elections, but they're disagreeing on the methods to achieve it. The escalation cannot be an alternative to the dialogue.
Protest groups say they will reject any partnership that brings the military to the power.
It's not clear what this year holds for Sudan in order for democratic polls to take place in 2023. Concessions must be made by many, and the protesters out of these streets, they say their campaign will not stop until Sudan is ruled by civilians alone. Naba Mohideen, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
The Transitional Sovereignty Council held its periodic meeting at the Republican Palace on Monday. In the gathering, Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan welcomed the initiative put forward by the United Nations to facilitate dialogue between Sudanese partners. He also called for the involvement of the African Union to support the initiative. The members of the Sovereignty Council have formally accepted Abdallah Hamdok's resignation as Sudan's Prime Minister.
The Council called for the need to expedite the formation of a caretaker government to fill the executive void, and also accepted the resignation of Dr. Abdallah Hamdok from the position of Prime Minister, and thanked him for the efforts he made for the sake of consensus.
Now, it goes without saying that the Horn of Africa region is complex and currently facing several crises. From Somalia's delayed election to the continued political unrest in Sudan, there is a lot to unpack. Well, earlier we talked to Mahia Mutua. He is the Horn of Africa Project Director for Crisis Group. He gave us a deeper insight into the region.
Well, the Horn of Africa has long been one of the continent's more unstable regions. You know, when you look as a proxy, for example, the number of peacekeepers deployed in the region, the number of internally displaced, the number of refugees. So there's quite a high number of those figures which indicate a degree of instability. I would say that one of the key things that's going on in the current moment is that the region is going through transition. And you're witnessing multiple transitions in very important countries. So you have Ethiopia, traditionally an anchor state, a very important so-called exporter of peace, one of the biggest contributors to peacekeeping missions around the world, currently going through a very, very contested transition. So it tends to be that every 3 decades you have these transitions. Very often they bring in new leaders that don't know each other, that have low levels of trust not just with the external actors, but also internally. So there are a number of factors. One, as I mentioned, the lack of trust, both internally among actors within the key countries, but also between countries. So for example, Sudan and Ethiopia, the leadership has tended to assume the worst about each other. Sudan thinks that Ethiopia is not cooperating, for example, on the Nile Dam, which is supposed to be a shared project that could bring dividends to both sides. Ethiopia, on the other hand, suspects Sudan of supporting rebels within Ethiopia. And so you have a breakdown of trust. And finally, you have very demanding young populations that want more than the previous generations, that would like especially the delivery of not just economic goods, but also political space.
Well, it's time for us to take a quick break. Coming up when we return. Russian-led military bloc to begin withdrawing troops deployed to Kazakhstan. And Southern African Development Community meets in Malawi to review progress of Mozambique mission. Welcome back and thank you for staying with us on Africa Live. Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev says a Russian-led military bloc will begin withdrawing its troops from the country in 2 days' time. That is, after fulfilling its main mission of stabilizing the Central Asian country following serious unrest. Last week, Kazakhstan asked the Moscow-led Collective Security Treaty Organization for support to deal with what President Tokayev described as an attempted coup. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the deployment had been crucial, claiming victory in defending Kazakhstan.
The situation in all Kazakhstan's regions is stable. Therefore, I have to say that the main mission of the CSTO peacekeeping forces has been successfully completed. In 2 days' time, a phased withdrawal of the CSTO United Peacekeeping Contingent will begin. The withdrawal process of the contingent will take no more than 10 days.
Moscow says talks between the United States and Russia in Geneva are a positive start to continued dialogue amid tensions over Ukraine. Earlier, both sides said there was no breakthrough after nearly 8 hours of negotiations on Monday. Russia has deployed thousands of troops near the border with Ukraine, which Washington and Kiev say is a clear posture for a potential invasion. Russia, however, says it has no such plans. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for a new summit with France, Germany and Russia to end the conflict. A man accused of intentionally setting South Africa's parliament on fire on the second day of the new year is now facing an additional charge of terrorism. 49-year-old Zandile Christmas Mafe is now being represented by one of South Africa's top lawyers, Advocate Dali Mpofu, who usually deals with high-profile cases. Renee Del Carme has more.
Gone was the disheveled appearance Mafe had when he appeared in court a week ago. He sported a new clean-cut and clean-shaven look. His legal team told the court that they'd been ambushed by the state's latest charge of terrorism, which alleges that the accused is guilty of contravening provisions of the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorism and Related Activities Act. Advocate Dalian Porfus said it was a travesty of justice that Mafe had been deprived of his right to apply for bail. At exactly 12:16 on Tuesday, Mafe's legal counsel informed the court that as of that moment, his client would be embarking on a hunger strike until he's granted the opportunity to apply for bail.
Our client is saying if our government failed him while he was outside, he sees no point for the government now to provide food for himself. He will only eat when his bail application is heard. He has got a right to be heard.
The accused was sent for observation after he was arrested to a district surgeon. The district surgeon observed him and found that he's suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. So we refer him to Falkenberg to ensure that the doctors and experts can assure us and say he is fit to understand what's going into trial. Then there's no problem after that.
And the man who's jailed wrongfully must be free. Yes.
Protesters outside the court came to show their solidarity with the accused, claiming he was a scapegoat whose only crime was being poor and black. Mafe will remain behind bars pending the availability of a bed in Cape Town's Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital, where he will undergo 30 days of mental evaluation. The case continues on the 11th of February. Renewable, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Meanwhile, the 16-member Southern African Development Community has started its 2 days of deliberations in Lilongwe, Malawi. The gathering is to review the progress of the regional bloc's mission in Mozambique. Troops from member countries have been deployed there since September to support Mozambique to combat terrorism and acts of violent extremism in the country's northern Cabo Delgado region. Angelo Coppola has more on that story now.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is chair of the SADC Organ on Politics, Defence and Security Cooperation. He's convened an extraordinary SADC Organ Troika Summit of heads of state from Botswana, Namibia and South Africa, and included Mozambique, to focus on that Mozambican mission. Of the 16 member SADC countries, 8 are contributing personnel or services to this mission. Their ministers are part of the first meeting, which started this morning. That meeting excludes Rwanda, who have a big military contingent in Cabo Delgado, fighting the insurgents there. A SADC spokesperson told CGTN that these talks were for SADC member states only. The Rwanda leadership weren't included in the SADC November talks either. Those November talks were in fact important because ministers sought to develop a framework to measure achievements and whether mandates had been achieved or not. It's expected to be presented to the SADC leaders over the next 2 days. A further extension is anticipated, and analysts expect that Mozambique will endorse this decision and suggestion, in fact. The meeting takes place just weeks after the SADC mission suffered its first fatality when a South African soldier was killed during an attack by insurgents. The next 2 days will see lots of behind-the-scenes negotiations and decisions that could bring stability to the northern region of Mozambique. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Tunisia's Ministry of Health says it is preparing for a possible 5th wave of COVID infections. The ministry says it has provided more ICU beds and increased oxygen supplies to health institutions across the country. Adnan Chawashi has more now from Tunis.
Dr. Heshmi Louzir heads the COVID-19 vaccination campaign in Tunisia, as well as the Pasteur Institute in the capital, Tunis. He has warned that infections linked with the Omicron and Delta variants are increasing across the North African country. He says people need to observe preventive measures as the country faces the possibility of a 5th wave of infections.
This new wave of infection started in Europe and has reached its peak. It's mainly caused by the spread of the Omicron variant globally. The Delta variant is also present, but Omicron spreads more rapidly in Tunisia. The health department is well prepared for the new wave, and we have provided oxygen and ICU beds at hospitals.
Have urged the government to take several measures to limit the spread of the virus.
The main recommendations are imposing a nighttime curfew and a 3-week ban on cultural gatherings, sports and cultural events to break the chain of infections with this fast-spreading Omicron variant, and this will prevent the 5th wave outbreak. We have also called for stepping up of the vaccination drive.
Tunisia is preparing for the 5th wave of coronavirus by increasing vaccinations countrywide. More than 6 million Tunisians have been fully vaccinated, even though many others remain reluctant to get their first dose.
Everyone should get vaccinated. It's safe and it saves lives. I have my vaccine certificate. Tunisian citizens must behave in a more responsible manner and respect the law.
I'm old and retired, but I refuse to get vaccinated. It's my body and I'm free. Imposing vaccination limits my freedom as a citizen.
Tunisian groups opposed to inoculations have organized several protests to denounce mandatory COVID-19 vaccination. The Tunisian government is trying to increase public trust in COVID-19 jabs. According to the health ministry, Omicron infections now account for 30 to 40% of cases undergoing genome sequencing at the Pasteur Institute in Tunis. The Delta variant represents around 60% of infections reported in the North African country. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Now in Egypt, a ban on smoking water pipes at cafes has hit some small business owners hard. Egyptian health authorities had feared that the popular smoking devices, popularly known as shisha, could rapidly raise COVID-19 infections. Since its implementation, the ban has pushed away many smokers from cafes across the North African nation, affecting their revenues. CGTN's Adel Mahroui has more details.
For 2 years now, the Egyptian government has been taking strict health measures to curb the spread of COVID-19 infections. One of the most prominent steps it took is a ban on smoking of water pipes, or as Egyptians like to call them, shisha. Because the pipes are usually shared among strangers and the smoking directly engages the respiratory system, Egyptian health officials feared the popular shisha would be a leading source of infections. As a result, most cafes have been deserted as water pipe smokers kept away.
Cafes have always been a perfect gathering for friends, but since the pandemic began, they have become lifeless. I don't smoke shisha, but most of my friends do. They go to cafes to enjoy the shisha while watching football games. Now both gatherings and shisha are banned. Since then, I don't get to see my friends as much.
Cafes are where we use our leisure time to socialize. We stay in the open air to play some games and meet friends. Public cafes like this one are affordable for all of us. It suits everyone. I don't smoke shisha, but my friends who do tend to vape or quit shisha and they stopped going to cafes. Shisha is a headache to prepare and easier to quit than cigarettes, so many people don't come here anymore.
Besides the ban on shisha, the government also restricted the capacity of cafes and other hospitality joints so as to maintain social distancing. That meant they ended up having fewer clients. Authorities also revised business hours, ending for the first time the 24 hours a day operation that was allowed prior to the pandemic. This further worsened the impact that the shisha ban has had on cafe owners.
I understand the risk of shisha as long as there are COVID cases, but we can operate it with limitations. Every client can only use his own device. We can make that work. I would say that 90% of my clients come for shisha. The drinks complement the shisha, not the other way around. After all, how hard is it to make tea or coffee at home?
Our prime profit comes from shisha, not in the drinks. 75% of my income got cut because of the pandemic. I used to hire 3 assistants. Today it's only me. I barely cover my expenses, my running costs and rent.
To ease the financial pressure they now face, cafe owners want the government to impose health measures that will allow them to operate the smoking water pipes while avoiding the possible spread of infections. Some are suggesting that clients purchase their own pipe, which then gets stored and labeled at cafes for their use. Others, however, don't mind sterilizing each device after use. For now, though, the ban remains in place even as cafe owners struggle to cope with the resultant challenges. Adil Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Well, let's take you through a quick reminder of our top stories this hour. The UN envoy to Mali is due to present a report to the UN Security Council on the situation in the country. Leaders from ECOWAS imposed fresh sanctions against Mali over delayed elections. Mali's interim military leadership has called for nationwide demonstrations on Friday against the stringent sanctions. Tensions between protesters and military leaders continues in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. The United Nations political mission in the country has urged opposition groups to reach a settlement, but protest blocs have rejected the initiative and are instead calling for an escalation of demonstrations against the military authorities. And Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev says a Russian-led military bloc will begin withdrawing its troops from the country in 2 days' time. That's after fulfilling its main mission of stabilizing the Central Asian country following serious unrest. And those are your top stories this hour. Let's now go to Rama, who's back in studio with the latest in business.
That's right, Mahia. Here's what's coming up in business news. Libya's government has ordered the immediate reopening of major oil fields in the country. And EU member states have lifted the suspension of flights to and from Southern Africa after Omicron variant concerns.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Let's start up north in Libya. The government over there has ordered the immediate reopening of major oil fields in the country. A statement released by the authorities in Tripoli says that the Prime Minister was briefed on the request of the Petroleum Facilities Guard. That's a Libyan oil company and a militia that controls much of the oil and gas infrastructure in the country. The Prime Minister issued instructions to reopen the Sharara, El Fil and Al Wafa oil fields with immediate effect. Now, data released from the state-owned National Oil Corporation does show that Libya's daily oil production has actually fallen by 500,000 barrels a day. Recently, that's due to maintenance work in some oil fields and previous shutdowns of oil production facilities by armed militia in other oil fields. EU member states have decided to lift the suspension of flights to and from Southern Africa. Passenger air travel from the region was suspended after the identification of the Omicron variant of COVID around November last year. Now, that measure came into effect on the 26th of November and it covered 7 countries: South Africa, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, Mozambique and Zimbabwe. Now, even though EU citizens and residents were able to return home by plane, the ban effectively meant that normal air travel basically ground to a halt. Back up north, Egypt's annual urban consumer price inflation slightly accelerated to 5.9% year-on-year in December from 5.6% the month before. That's according to the latest data from the country's statistics agency. Month-on-month, the headline indicator showed inflation at minus 0.1% in December compared to 0.1% in November. Now, the annual rate does remain within the 5 to 9% range that's been set by the central bank, which kept its key policy rate essentially unchanged in its regular Monetary Policy Committee meeting held on the 16th of December. Egypt's economy has roared back after sagging during the worst of the coronavirus pandemic. The North African state's GDP actually went up by 9.8% year-on-year in the third quarter of the year, compared to 0.7% growth a year earlier. And we're still up north in Egypt. The country's renewable energy capacity is set to go up by nearly 70%, roughly 4 gigawatts, over the next 5 years. That's according to the International Energy Agency in its latest estimates. Effectively, that would bring the country's total generation capacity to around 10.1 gigawatts by 2026, up from 6.1 gigawatts at the moment. As Yasser Kim now reports, the country is looking to have at least 42% of its electricity coming from green renewable sources by 2030.
The International Energy Agency says the world will add 4.8 thousand gigawatts of renewable energy in the next 5 years, and Egypt is one of the countries that will contribute to this share. Egypt is leading North Africa with 68% increase in renewable electricity output by 2026, just ahead of Morocco, and is expected to make up 12.5% of the region's expected 32 gigawatts in new renewable energy capacities in 5 years.
Egypt is blessed with excellent resources, especially in wind and solar. So that is one factor. The other factor is the investment environment is attractive, and in most projects there is government guarantees that the production of the renewable energy resources regarding electricity will be bought by the state-owned utilities.
Though solar power is the most productive in Egypt, wind energy will be the fastest growing in the next few years, more than doubling to exceed 3.2 gigawatt by 2026.
The resources are perfect, especially in the area of the Red Sea as well as the Gulf of Suez, where wind speeds are in the range of 12 meters per second. So that's quite attractive. Other resources as well is in the west side of the Nile, where the wind speeds are in the range between 5 and 7 meters per second. So it's quite attractive. The other thing is Egypt has done a number of wind projects already since the late 80s, and so we have good experience in that.
The North African government has also allocated more than 7,000 square kilometers of land suitable for renewable energy projects. The private sector currently accounts for about 34% of total output, but is expected to be the major contributor in the next phase, especially with mega projects like the Bemban Solar Park, which is one of the largest worldwide. Despite being an attractive destination for energy investors, there are still some outstanding issues that investors want the state to address.
One of the complaints was the arbitration law in the feed-in tariff contracts with the government. That the government wanted to apply the Egyptian law, and most of the investors wanted an external arbitration, and this was mitigated. And there have been another challenge just a year ago or so, after projects have been done, that the government introduced fees to connect to the grid that is different than that made some of the projects have some feasibility problem.
Some investors also want the government to reduce custom duties on imported solar panels to lower the cost of production. Officials say the government is dealing with these concerns to be able to achieve its long-term strategy for electricity output from renewable energy to reach 42% from the current 20% by 2030. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
On to South Africa now, where a runaway wildfire does continue to cause havoc in Cape Town. It's destroying property and stretching firefighting resources there. The blaze has already destroyed large tracts of land and has threatened a luxury golf resort as well as local vineyards. Landowners are assisting firefighters to try and contain this blaze, but strong winds are hampering their efforts. CGTN's Travis Andrews has the details.
Cape Town's annual fire season is in full swing, and the latest blaze has already caused widespread damage to vegetation and plantations. The Claremont fire is raging just outside of Cape Town, stretching local firefighting resources to their limits. Landowners have joined the efforts to contain the blaze, which has already caused damage to some of their properties as well as the forest.
The last estimate that we had was this morning. We're looking at about 3,700 hectares then of fynbos and pine and slash. So far, to my knowledge, one structure has been lost and nothing else. So we hope we are able to save all the structures.
The Arabella Golf Estate was also threatened, as well as wine farms. The fire jumped the road at many locations as it spread to other areas. Residents from the local informal settlement also had to be evacuated, leaving many helpless.
I left my city, that settlement. It's a wildfire. Yeah, we saw it in 2 days back, this fire, but they tried to manage it, but they didn't, not yet. Yeah, they try to control the fire, but the fire is damaging the city now.
Huge plumes of smoke made visibility bad, which led to road closures to keep motorists safe. The fire is being fanned by these southeasterly winds, which usually arrive in the summertime and make the blaze very difficult to contain.
The winds are not helping us at the moment, and later we've got a wind shift which will make efforts a lot more difficult, well, possibly anyway. So. Arabella's western side, the Kleinmond side, was under threat. They've had a Huey putting down some water on that fence line, so I think they should be okay, but they are getting a lot of little spot fires coming in.
For now, firefighters will continue with their efforts to contain the blaze and are hoping that the expected rainfall may assist them. Travis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
A quick run through commodities. Oil rose towards $82 a barrel on Tuesday, supported by tight supply and hopes that rising COVID cases and the spread of the Omicron variant will not derail a global demand recovery. Now, OPEC supply additions are running below their allowed increase under a pact with allies due to a lack of capacity in some key producing countries. Major economies have avoided a return to severe lockdowns, even as coronavirus cases there do soar. Brent crude went up by about $1.22 a barrel, roughly 1.5%, to trade at $82.09 after dropping 1% in the previous session. The price of Brent was up 50% last year, and it's rallied even further in 2022, as investors essentially see Omicron as having limited effect on demand, while OPEC and its allies, known as OPEC Plus, slowly ease back record output cuts that they made in 2020. Now, a much weaker US dollar also did help support oil on Tuesday, as it makes oil cheaper for those holding other currencies, and it tends to reflect a much higher investor risk appetite. Now, the cryptocurrency market is continuing the new year slump, with the price of Bitcoin declining to its lowest in more than 3 months. The oldest of the cryptocurrencies we have bounced off lows of the day after falling by as much as 6% to $39,774 in New York trading. That brings its loss this year alone, and remember, we're about 11 days into 2022, to roughly 14%. That decline is the largest for start of the year since at least 2012. It slumped more than 40% since reaching an all-time high of nearly $69,000 in early November. Bitcoin was created in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis by an anonymous individual or group that went by the name Satoshi Nakamoto, and it still gained almost 500% since the end of 2019. Bitcoin first started trading in 2009. Pricing information from its early days, however, is still pretty limited. And I'll leave it there for the time being. I'll be back at the top of the hour, though. We'll be talking about the IMF's latest warning. It's telling emerging market economies to brace themselves for rough times as tighter monetary policies enacted by the US Fed could trigger capital outflows and currency depreciations. So how should economies, especially here in Africa, react and prepare themselves for this tightening? We'll explore that and plenty more at the top of the hour. See you then. For now, back to Mahia.
Rama, thank you. Well, still to come here on Africa Live. In the sport, Algeria held to goalless draw in their Africa Cup of Nations opener.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find